Hello, everybody. This is Scott Yanow, and hello to everyone in Facebook land, and welcome to the latest episode of Jazz Anonymous. Really, because all of us have a problem with jazz in that we have to hear it all the time. Once you get addicted to the music, that's pretty much it. I've been listening to jazz pretty much nonstop since about 1970, and haven't gotten tired of it yet, and haven't gotten over it. In fact, if I don't hear bebop every 4 hours or so, I get the shakes. So it's definitely not something that you can get over. I first discovered jazz, and my addiction, I guess, really began when I saw the movie The Five Pennies. I saw it about 1969 or so, thereabouts. The movie's from the late 50s, and it features Danny Kaye in a kind of a semi-fictional story of Red Nichols' life, the cornet player from the 20s. And it's quite entertaining, and it just looked like the musicians were having such a great time. It's just amazing how they could just show up at clubs and suddenly sit in and play perfectly, without any rehearsal, without having to worry about being in the right key or knowing what song is going to come up. They just did it perfectly. So it just looked like a wonderful fantasy world. About a year later, in 1970, I happened to see in the LA Times that it was mentioned that there was a Dixieland radio show that's on from 5 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. Now, I actually can't imagine that being true today, but at the time, that I just thought, oh, this is happy music. Maybe I'll give it a little listen. Well, that was the beginning of my addiction, really, because within a week or so, I was starting to use my little cassette tape recorder and taping things off the radio, and didn't really stop after that. I've been a record collector ever since. In fact, here's the first album I ever had. It's the very best of Al Hurd and Pete Fountain from 1957 or so, and I blame it. It's this record's fault that I'm a jazz addict. It really started with that, and I refuse to take responsibility. So. For the first 6 months or so, I listened to Dixieland all the time. And then I discovered a swing radio show, Chuck Cecil's Swinging Years. So then I, was really getting into modern jazz because I was up to 1945. So when I first went to college in 1971, I had a record collection of 25 albums. And people would look at it and they would say, oh, what a huge record collection. It's amazing. Until they started looking at it and they said Dukes of Dixieland, Louis Armstrong, Benny Goodman. So they figured I had to be crazy, which they weren't far off the mark because I was already part of the way there to being a jazz addict. And what happened in college is that I kept on hearing the names Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And I thought, well, they seem to be the next step in jazz beyond Benny Goodman. And I wanted to get an idea, what happened to the music since, was jazz still alive? I thought it might have died by the mid-40s with the end of the swing era. So I went to a used record store, College Records, and this is near Cal State Northridge, and I saw an album for $1.99, a Charlie Parker album. And I said, well, I don't know any of these songs, Grooving High, Not in Tunisia, never heard of those tunes. But it had him playing a song called White Christmas. And I said, oh, I know that tune. It happened to be a request for a radio show that he was on 1948. So I bought the album and couldn't get into it at all at first. But I persevered. I listened to it 2 or 3 times a day for about 5 days. And by the 5th day, the doors had opened. And, well, this is what I blame for my love of bebop. It really started with this one. And it's been a sad case ever since because pretty soon I was listening to all kinds of much more modern jazz. And within a few months, I was listening to Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders doing some screaming in 1966 and listening to Freddie Hubbard and Buddy Rich and the top players of the time period. And the people that thought I was crazy for listening to Dixieland when I would put on Pharoah Sanders, they knew I was crazy because I'd already passed them. So ever since then, I've been an addict to jazz. It's kind of a sad case, but it became my goal really within a short period of time to basically try to get every good jazz record ever made and also have the time to listen to it at least once. And that's a goal I'm still working on. I actually have a book that I put together, a loose leaf book that has quite a few pages in it, in which I list the 2,332 albums I still want from jazz history. So it's going to take a little while, and I'm sure I'll fall about 1,000 short, but it keeps me from ever being bored because I haven't been bored since then, except when I'm away from jazz. And what really did me in was a concert I went to in 1972 at the Hollywood Bowl. I mean, it probably cost about $3 for me to get in. And imagine this lineup. Ella Fitzgerald, still in her prime, the Count Basie Orchestra, the Stan Kenton Orchestra, which that was the only time I saw them, Cannonball Adderley Quintet, Stan Getz Quartet, and Oscar Peterson playing solo piano. Oscar Peterson actually stole the show. He got standing ovations literally after every song he played. Same thing happened to Monterey when I saw him do that about a decade later. But yeah, after that concert, I was definitely addicted. There was no hope for me. I was an accounting major in school, and I became an accountant for a while, but it just seemed like for some reason, my heart wasn't quite in that. So jazz was much more fun. And by constant hustling, I've been able to make a career as a freelance jazz critic ever since. Now, you might hear from jazz journalists, writers who call themselves jazz journalists or jazz historians. Basically, they're critics. They just don't like the name. What we try to do, the best of us anyway, and most of us really, is try to describe the music that we are lucky enough to hear in a way that readers will be able to tell whether they're going to enjoy the music or not. If I am talking about, say, an avant-garde performance full of free improvisations, I'll give enough clues in it. So if someone is into New Orleans jazz or bebop and they don't really like hearing solo saxophones, then they'll know. Whether I like the music or not is less important than me conveying to the audience what the music sounds like. So that way they'll know whether they like it. I mean, to me, the greatest compliments that I ever receive are from jazz fans and jazz collectors who tell me, "Oh, I discovered this artist because of you," or, "Thanks to you, I'm going bankrupt because I bought too many records, and now my wife's complaining because I don't have enough room." Well, if you don't have the room, if you have too many records, then you're on the right track. And if you have plenty of room for your records, you don't have enough of them. You got to get a lot more, because there's just so much to discover. Throughout my career, I have listened to all eras of jazz. I've never really confined myself to one time period. I still love 1920s and 30s jazz. I always will. And people come to the music through different directions. A lot of them discover jazz because maybe they heard a rock group where they're improvising a bit, or maybe they like late period Miles Davis, or through any of logical ways. In my case, I happen to start pretty much at the beginning and work my way forward. And the advantage to that was that it doesn't bother me if I hear a 1920s record and the recording quality is not that good, or the harmonies are pretty simple, because that's how it was at the time period. And I always love to see how it all connects together. At the same time, I listen to the most modern jazz too, because I want to see where the future is, and I want to see where it's going to be going. So that's why I listen to all eras of jazz. A lot of the critics around today may not really be that familiar with jazz before Coltrane or before Charlie Parker, but really it started around 1895 with Buddy Bolden, and certainly on records by 1917. So, and all those recordings are worth exploring. There's great music in every era. And sometimes I'm asked, what do I listen to, and what do I listen for in a recording? When I review it. And what I really listen to is the musician's personality, their ability to take chances, the color that they bring to the music, hopefully with some humor along the way. And I try to see if they're achieving whatever their goal might be. I mean, I don't expect someone who's playing New Orleans jazz to be playing Charlie Parker licks, and I don't expect a bebopper to be playing free jazz, or a free jazz person to play chord changes necessarily. It depends on what the project is. There's just no shortage of great recordings to listen to, and it's a lifetime goal just to really hear everything. Sometimes people get very critical about jazz critics, and jazz critics are not above criticism, really. But I think most of them are just trying their best and hopefully conveying to the listener what the music sounds like. Now, throughout, let me give a little bit of advice to critics, in that I think critics should always be aware of their audience, and they should try their best to talk to them, not talk down to them, but give a little bit of information. Like if you're reviewing a Sonny Rollins record, you should say early on that he's a tenor saxophonist. You should say that because not everybody knows. At the same time, if you're reviewing a reissue, you should tell the jazz fans that's reading it how much of the music has not been issued before, and really how does it compare to the music of the time period. Not all jazz is cutting edge, not all jazz is pushing ahead. I mean, that was true from say 1920 to about the late 70s or so. You could look at the history of jazz as a race towards freedom. Music in 1925 was out of date by 1930, at least in the mind of people listening to it. And music in, say, 1965, well, that's a bit out of date by 1970. It kept on that way, just a very fast evolution. It slowed down after that because it changed. All these names of jazz styles like Dixieland, swing, bebop, hard bop, avant-garde, but there aren't very many names for the music after 1980. There's M-bass and there's retro swing, or post-bop. But in general, jazz changed because there was no longer one or two people that were really leading the way. It became to a point where dozens and dozens of great artists are playing their own style. They're leading their own way. I mean, what would you call Pat Metheny's music? It's modern jazz, I guess, but there isn't any catchy name to it. And because of that, sometimes people think, oh, jazz has slowed down. There hasn't been anything new since fusion. And that's completely wrong, because there is so much new music and there's so many different directions going on at one time that it's really come to the point where it's almost impossible to keep up with everything. In fact, it is impossible unless you're a complete fanatic and listen 10 to 12 hours a day, which is what I try for. But even then, I know for a while that there's probably a great Finnish trombonist or an Italian bass player who I should know about, but don't have their recordings. It is my goal to get everything, but there are just so many records coming out at any one time. And I use the term records to mean both LPs and CDs. Now, downloads to me are not really records. Downloads are the equivalent of cassette tapes of the 70s and 80s, in that I understand why a lot of musicians are putting out their music exclusively as downloads, but I think it's a mistake. They should always do it. Downloads should be there in conjunction with CDs, because really, when was the last time you invited someone over to see your download collection? When it's something that you could just erase with a push of a button, it doesn't seem very permanent to me. And of course, I like liner notes and like to know the story behind the music, really. I mean, I perfectly understand saving money, but I do think that CDs should still stick around until there's some replacement, something that you could really own, as opposed to just owning some air on the computer. Anyway, I thought, since I've been talking a bit, I think it's time for a little intermission music. And this is a song called Fidgety Feet that I'm going to play on the melodica. Now, it was written around 1919, 1918 or so, but no, I didn't compose it. So here's my first and only take of it, and see what you think. next time you see a piano player and he has a melodica sitting on the keyboard, and he's planning on using it on some background for a Brazilian song, well, you should request that he play Fidgety Feet, see what he says. Anyway, that's what I do in my spare time, which is usually spent listening to records. That seems to be about my main activity for the last 50 years. Hope you enjoyed that. So I should mention, I guess, everybody know what your accomplishments are and what have I done. And, since I've been writing for a long time, it's piled up because I spend an awful lot of time on writing. So these days I write for 7 magazines on a regular basis, including, Downbeat Jazzes. It's always a challenge to see if I can name them all. Downbeat Jazzes, LA Jazz Scene, New York City Jazz Records, Syncopated Times, one called Jazz Artistry Now, and also one out of England called The Rag. So that's part of what I do. I also write press biographies for musicians and for labels. I do liner notes. I've written, I think it's 914 so far. I've reviewed in my career over 20,000 CDs and LPs, recording reviews. I think might be more than anyone, but I don't think anyone else is really counting. And I also written 11 books. I'm working on a 12th one, which is going to be my musical memoirs. Not memoirs so much my playing, which is on a very part-time basis, but of the things I've seen, some interviews from the past, and a lot of great concerts that I've seen along the way. Oh, by the way, I play a little bit of clarinet and tenor also, in addition to melodica. But since Eddie Daniels and Lou Tabakin are still very much with us, I don't think there's any great demand for me to play those. But melodica, well, not too much competition. So looking at my list of other great questions that people might ask you. Oh, how did I survive the pandemic? Well, luckily in this field, since I'm mostly home a lot of the time anyway, and I'm listening to recordings, and since jazz artists have continually come out with new recordings, even during the worst years of the pandemic, I've been one of the lucky ones. My work hasn't slowed down at all. In fact, it seems to have sped up a little. It's a lot different than being, say, a shoe salesman or working in an airline, or, a lot of jobs have disappeared. If you're a waiter, it's difficult, but sitting here playing records, listening to the world's greatest music, well, what could be better, really? And I do think of jazz as the world's greatest music. Now, of course, classical music is perfectly played, and rock and country music tell better stories sometimes. And, there's great musicians in any particular genre. But the reason I listen to jazz is just for the excitement of it all, the excitement of a musician going on stage and making up music as they go along. Even in situations where they're playing tight arrangements, the solos are generally spontaneous. And the musicians are taking a chance. That's one of the most exciting parts about it, is that they could fail. They could miss. But if they do, if they're a good enough musician, they could cover it up. But still, they might not play exactly what they want, or they might discover something completely new. That's what's great fun about it. That's what's particularly fun about seeing live performances, because you could see from the way that they react to each other if what they're playing is unexpected. You can't get that from recording, but recordings are really their final legacy, really. And it is amazing how many great jazz recordings there are. So if you ask a jazz critic why do they get into writing about it, if they don't say it's for the records, then they're not telling you the truth, because that's the original reason they get into it. All the free records, it's a crazy life in a way, because I prefer Mondays to Sundays, because on Sunday there's no mail, right? And so no records come. That's pretty tragic. I have to go out to a record store and buy something. So, I never get tired of this. So let's see now. And what's the music's future? That's always a good question. And that's one I can't answer, because nobody can answer. I think that as long as there are so many young jazz musicians, so many young musicians coming out and playing jazz and expressing themselves in the music will always prosper, at least artistically. Commercially is another problem, but artistically, it's moving ahead. It's moving in all different directions at once. It's been true throughout the history that jazz artists have sought to combine their music with that of other music that's around at the time period. I mean, it started out with New Orleans jazz, combining the idea of jazz along with marches and ragtime and hymns and folk songs. And the same idea applies today. Gets today's pop music to a certain extent, and today's music from other genres gets combined with jazz. And there's always people saying, "Oh, it's not jazz. It doesn't sound, it's not straight ahead. It's not 4/4 rhythm. It's not based on bebop or the blues." Well, it generally is, but it might be a few generations past that. So I'm very optimistic about the future of jazz. And I don't, although I know of no other music that in which people constantly claim that it's dead or it's dying. I actually read an article once from 1923 in which the author says, "Well, jazz is finally dead." So I think he was probably wrong. Possibly 22, 23, but not 1923. And it's very much around today. In fact, I would, without having any details on it and without having any statistics, I would guess that there are more people playing jazz right now than ever before, because of practically every country in the world. You never know where the next great artist is going to come from. And because there are so many records coming out and so few record labels, artists are doing that themselves to a large extent. We might not even know for a few years who is the best artist of this year, who's the one that's doing the most innovative music. But it's being done. So to critics, going back to what I said before, to other critics, I would say just know your audience and talk to them and do your best to, fight for jazz. Always fight for jazz. At the same time, and do your best to introduce the music to people that may not have that much of, may not know it that well, or may not have that good an opinion of it. There's always some aspect of jazz and some era of jazz that will appeal to just about anyone. To fans, I would say, when you read stuff that a critic writes, realize that it's just that person's educated opinion. It isn't necessarily the way it is. It's what he or she happens to hear. And if you like what a particular critic writes, and if that critic has an opinion similar to yours, then follow them, and you could probably trust their opinion. But if they don't like this kind of music you like, it doesn't mean that the kind of music you like isn't any good. It just means maybe the critic's no good. Not all critics are on the same level. That they try their best, but some are better than others. I mean, in my mind, none are better than the late Whitney Balliet. I mean, his writing was poetry, really. And if you get a chance to pick up any of the books of his writing, you'll see what I mean, because you could actually hear the music in his writing. He's like the Art Tatum of writers. So the rest of us can just look with a little bit of envy and do our best. And to musicians now, and to publicists, the question comes up: how do you, how do you approach and how do you deal with critics? Because you want your music to be reviewed, and of course, favorably. Everybody wants a good review. Well, what the publisher should do, or a musician that is acting as their own publicist, is just to explore that critic's writing, see if that person has a similar taste to yours, similar musical taste, and then you have a better chance of getting a good review. If that critic doesn't think that jazz exists before 1970, and you're a swing performer, then he or she's probably not the right person to send it to. And also, as a publicist, publishers should realize that some of us are lucky enough to be buried in new releases all the time. So if let's say you send me a CD in the mail, don't call me 2 days later and ask me if I heard it or what I think of it, because I haven't even received it yet. Wait a couple weeks and then ask what I think, and chances are I still haven't heard it, but your phone call might very well give me an incentive to listen to it. And then a couple weeks later, ask the same question, and a couple weeks after that. One of the ways to get through life and to get things accomplished is to be both patient and persistent. You don't take it personally if your requests are ignored initially, but be persistent in a logical way. Not an annoyance, but just to do your best to contact and be friendly to the writer, and be have a good idea what that person goes through. Well, I think that's most of the possible questions I would have. I think I do think that it's a very fun life being a jazz critic. I tell people that I get up at the stroke of dusk. I listen to I listen to 5 or 6 records and complain to people how hard I'm working, and I eat everything in sight and go back to bed. It's not quite that easy, but sometimes it seems that way. It just seems like I'm on vacation all the time. Because what can be more fun, really, than listening to this music and being able to hear so many new releases and all? And I never take it for granted. So it's been an addiction for 50 years, and I've enjoyed it. It's one of the best addictions in the world. And so if you find yourself getting addicted to jazz, and I'm sure most of you probably are to one extent or another, don't fight it. Just keep your ears open and listen to everything you possibly can. And like I say, if you don't have room for your records, well, get some more room. Don't get rid of the records, because it's just too many gems. So
Scott, you have a question. Mm-hmm. You have a question from Dennis Day. He says, do you think radio programmers still prefer CDs over audio files or WAV files for radio play?
Well, you'd have to really ask them. I think originally they didn't take downloads at all. Now I think some of them are. Personally, I hope downloads go away. I mean, it makes things easier as far as being able to review a record quicker, because I could get it. If someone has something come out, I could get it today as opposed to waiting a few days. But like I said earlier, no one's going to come by and look at your download collection, really. For radio, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. For some critics actually prefer downloads, but, well, they're not true record collectors, right? They probably have room in their homes for other things.
Thank you.
So it's been a pleasure being on the show. I think I have like 2 minutes left, and normally I would just open it up to questions, but in this format, well, I'll check all the comments in a little bit, and I'll answer the ones I can. But all I say is just have sympathy for jazz critics, really. They do their best, and most of them are pretty good. And I certainly wouldn't trade this life for being a rich accountant. So normally I'd play some records for you, but that's something for you to do for yourself. But if you ever see this record again, ever see this record around, pick it up. That's how I started. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.